Okay, so I've got this marked off where we can share some of these pages together. Chapter 24, the day of the wedding, on page 304. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. It was already warm. The sun was brutal, baking the ground as early as 10 a.m. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, though, and Ryder supposed that he had to go ahead and take as good as an omen. He kept replaying the previous night over and over in his mind. It had been something different for him. He had proposed and she accepted. He held her hand and walked her back to the camper and kissed her good night, and then he left her right there, proposing that they would be a little bit more traditional than they had been up to that point, going ahead and staying away from each other in the hours leading up to the wedding. He didn't know whether or not she found that romantic. As far as he was concerned, it was about to be the best he could do to show her that it meant something, to show her that it just wasn't being thrown away thing, and it mattered to him. How wonderful for her. That they were going to make vows that were essentially already part of who they were, already a part of their friendship, but it wasn't going to become official today in front of friends and God and everybody that mattered. Given the circumstances, he wasn't having the church wedding his mom would have wanted, or having a priest, but they were tight on a time frame. They were going to sign paperwork. Ryder Daniels was that kind of man who never defaulted on a loan, never went back on an agreement, never shook hands on something and didn't stick to it. That meant for him the wedding was final. So it mattered, and it really did. He had put on a suit, too, a suit and a black cowboy hat, and the sun was sort of resting on top of the fabric, mocking him a bit. He imagined this was what it was like to wear a coffin. Stuffy, completely and totally constricting. But he was doing it for her. He wanted to do it for her. They hadn't gotten off to the official wedding party, but Logan was the best man, with Iris, Rose, Pansy serving, and Sammy's maids of honors. Iris had outdone herself, baking a cake that was scant frosting and flowers and berries pouring over it, serving as a decoration. It was very Sammy. She was also worked at making a beautiful lunch, which was absolutely overkill, considering the only attendants to the wedding were the family, the minister, his wife, and Pansy's fiancé. It wasn't like it was a big shindig, and not altogether different from the 4th of July gathering that they had only a couple weeks earlier. But everybody had put on their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and they had all looked dang serious, like this was some kind of momentous occasion, and it added to the constricting sense that Ryder had been noticing not for long. But Logan approached him, not in a suit, but wearing a sports jacket, which he had assured Ryder was the best he could do without disgrading. Be good to her, Logan said. I will, Ryder said. I've been nothing but good to her all these years. Yeah, but it's different now. Yeah, so everybody keeps saying. I got her a ring. Really? I did. That's why we built this big trellis thing. I have a real wedding band in my pocket, too. Did you get yourself a ring? If Sammy cares about that, she'll make sure I get one. He didn't know why he was so sure of that, only that he was. You going to wear it? Of course. When I make vows, I stick to 'em, and I'm not going to have any trouble where she's concerned. Not going to be tempted to sleep around with other women? He laughed, the sound rusty getting stuck in his throat. I've had trouble forcing myself to look at other women for the past 17 years. Now that I have her, it's going to be no trouble at all to look only at her. How wonderful. I knew you were in love with her, Logan said, all this time. He shook his head. I wish it were that easy and that simple. I just want to keep her forever. Isn't that love? Ryder said no. My parents were so good to each other. They helped each other out effortlessly, completed each other, didn't clash with each other. They didn't. I don't know. It doesn't matter. They're dead. They're not here today, and I'm about to be a father, and in just a few short years, and I'll be the same age as my dad when he died. He noticed that Logan's face had taken on a strange expression, probably because he was being strange, but he really didn't care. He felt owed in his breakdown. Life's a witch, and I'm not going to worry about what this thing between me and Sammy is. I'll take care of her. I promised her that much. See that you do, Logan said, and maybe don't worry so much about what somebody else's marriage looked like. You've never even seen a marriage. How would you know? That was a low blow, digging at the fact that Logan's mom was single. True, Logan said, but then, if ever I was going to fall in love, I suppose I would accept the fact that it was going to be my own particular brand of messed up, since I have nothing else to compare it to. Well, aren't you enlightened? Logan shrugged. Yeah, pretty much. Leave most of the out of your best man speech, please. Logan pushed his hat back on his head. Was I supposed to write a speech? I thought I would just tell everybody to drink. Stick with that. After that, the pastor showed up and everybody began to assemble and take their places beneath the canopy. He stood there wondering which direction Sammy would come from. It was part of her charm that they hadn't done the rehearsal of any kind, that she had said that he was just going to have to see what happened. He wondered if she was thinking about her father, because of course traditionally a father gave his daughter away when they walked down the aisle, but her father had given her away to Ryder a long time ago, had turned over those rights as protector, and that he wasn't using. He wasn't that different, and it really wasn't that it wasn't that different. It wasn't really. Except last night had been completely different, rings and dancing and romance. Except it felt different with him standing there in a tuxedo, unable to catch his breath. He shook hands with the pastor, Michael, and then stood waiting. Rose, Iris, and Pansy came up one by of the little hills, linking arms. The three of them were wearing light-colored summer dresses. Smiling, suddenly they reminded themselves of children. Something strange twisted in his chest, and he tried to breathe around it, tried and failed. Smiling, they stood across from Logan, and he found himself between two groups. The people he loved the most in the world, except for the ones who was about to stand next to him. And she was probably the only person on earth that would kill him to protect, which was ideal because he did something to Sammy he would deserve it. And then he could pay them any attention anymore because he was looking at the spot over the hill where Sammy would appear, where he would finally see his bride, and then suddenly there she was. He saw her hair first, all backlit by the sun, a wreath of flowers placed over the top of her curls. It was flying wild and like he liked it. And suddenly he was bitterly angry with himself for not being with her last night, because he might do something now to keep him from having this entirely inappropriate reaction to her. Because you weren't supposed to want nothing more than to immediately skip straight to kissing the bride, and then go to the wedding night. At least not in front of the minister. No, heck no. It took him a moment, because he was so captivated by her beauty, to notice the dress. A real wedding gown, sleeveless, skimming her curves, all beautiful, delicate lace. She was holding a bouquet of wildflowers that he was sure that she had probably gone out and picked herself that morning, because it was who she was, and she was his bride. Every little inch of herself was still, the impact that never lessened, that she was Sammy, and Sammy that he knew when they kissed, when they were together, when they got married. She didn't transform into something else or someone else. Sammy, his Sammy, in a wedding gown. Moving toward him, she lifted up the front of her gown, and one hand was still clenched toward the bouquet, and she began to run toward him, and his heart stood still. She laughed by the time she got to the canopy. Sorry, she said breathlessly. That was taking too long. I agree, he murmured. She took his hand, and they began the ceremony. The pastor was speaking their vows first, with them repeating after, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, as long as they both lived. I do. And then Pastor Michael asked if they had rings. He reached in the pocket and took out the box, producing the band that went along with the engagement ring he presented to Sammy the night before. A little impish smile curved her lips, and she shifted her bouquet from one hand to the other, and that was when he saw the hammered gold band on her thumb. It was a big, even for that digit, and thick, and clearly for him. She slipped it off her finger and held it out to him. Then he took her left hand in his and slipped the band on her finger, and then he gave her his left hand, letting her put on the band on his. Perfect size, he said. Yours too, she whispered, almost like we know each other. By the power vested in me, by the state of Oregon, by the most important God, Pastor Michael said that last part in like a warning. God was involved, and this better stick. It better be real. I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Wife. In his mind he's thinking it was real. Husband and wife. So he did. He grabbed her, he kissed her like he couldn't bear to let her go. He kissed her until neither of them could breathe. He kissed her because he thought maybe it would say something that he didn't know how to say, put order to feelings that were riding around inside him that he didn't have any vocabulary for. Or maybe because he didn't have any grapefruits for them. He didn't really know. And when he pulled away, everybody clapped and cheered. Everybody who has always been there, including Sammy at Hope Springs Ranch. It was also the same, and yet so completely different. He didn't know how to hang on to that feeling and examine it, didn't even know what to call it. It was all nostalgia wrapped in a brand new package, and he was afraid of what he might find if he examined it too closely. The only pictures they got were on everyone's phone, and when they cut the cake, Rose was chanting for him to smash it into Sammy's face. But he wouldn't do that. He was supposed to take care of Sammy, and he would never in a million years do something to disrupt the reverence that he found today. She laughed and smeared a little bit of the frosting on his lips, and then surprised by licking it off before laughing and kissing him. Then Logan started to play a song on his guitar, and then for them to become to dance. And he pulled her against them, and they brought her back underneath the arbor, and he was glad that he had done this the night before. A dance was just for the two of them because it was fine doing it in front of his family, but it wasn't quite the same as it had been to hold her against him when they were not a show. And when it was all over, he finally realized the change had happened, the shift, because he thought of Sammy now. She would no longer be his friend first. She would be his wife, and soon the mom to his kid. His. That was the bottom line, and wasn't it? What he had always known, that from the beginning she was his. And when he swept off to bed that night, his bed, their words played over and over in his head that his wife, his. He was living a life that he had never even imagined wanting. One that he actively terrified him for so long that he could remember. To have this woman in his arms, his bed, his house, his heart, that mattered so dang much, because life was cruel and loss could hit you when you least expected it. And he knew better than most, because to want to hold on to someone so tight was a terror that he had never ever wanted to experience, because he knew that no matter how tight you held, someone could be torn from your grasp, because he knew that love can keep someone with you, no matter how fierce you felt it. But he had also lived a life that proved that it could bond people together in the throes of grief, and that you could stitch together new things out of broken pieces. But it was hard to figure out which truth to take on board. It was hard to figure out which thing to let be largest. It was easier, damnedest easier, to let it be fear. Fear was so easy. He had learned that early. Because if you let it hide, it was the rest of everything, and that was so much harder. But as he lay there next to his new wife, exhausted from making boom with her, looking at her face, relaxed in the sleep and the light of the moon coming through the window, she had climbed through as a teenager into a bed that they now shared, that was now theirs. He knew there was nothing that was more beautiful that would ever come easy. And Ryder was a man who had been built for being tough. So that was exactly what he would be. Kind of throws a little bit over to Rip and Beth in a way, doesn't it? When I always picture when Beth asked him after she was assaulted, he broke in and he was shot, and she's like, "Does it hurt?" And he's like, "Yeah, it hurts, but I've been built to go through hell." Anyway, just thought I would share that. They had been married a week. It was a strange thing, living in the ranch, a house, and something that she hadn't entirely thought about when they had gotten engaged. She had woken up late that morning, as she started to do, and he made sure that there was a bowl of fruit sitting there on the table for her, covered with plastic wrap, and all ready for her to eat. In insult to injury, their baby did not like bacon, and given that bacon was a big foundation of their natural friendship, she felt somewhat betrayed. How on earth had their genetics combined to make a being that didn't care for the most sacred cured meats? She didn't have an answer for that. She truly didn't. But she sat down in front of the fruit, grateful, and pulled the bowl to herself. Then she heard footsteps in the kitchen, and in walked Ryder, her husband, holding a cup of coffee. He set the coffee down in front of her and inhaled. "You know, pregnant women can have one cup. It's fine." "You're an expert," she said, reaching out gratefully, taking the hold of the mug. "I'm starting to be. So when you think we ought to make a doctor's appointment?" She looked up at him before she popped a grape in her mouth. He was so conventional and beautiful. She never got tired of him looking at him in this new way. She could still see what she had seen for all those years, but she saw new things too. Like looking at a drawing that had been traced over another, she could still see both visions clearly, and the love both in different sorts of fashions. Her familiar friend was so dear to her, but her lover, her husband, was infinitely fascinating. It was amazing how a man she had known for so long could be still so surprising. Except the question did not surprise her, really, not really. "I want a midwife," she said. The air around her seemed to skip a beat as he reacted to that muscle twitching slightly in his cheek. "You're kidding," he said. "No," she said, "I want a midwife." I don't understand. That was like the kind of thing that you had when you lived on the prairie and couldn't get an actual doctor." "Incorrect, but thank you for dropping your knowledge into this very female subject." That check ticked again. "You need a doctor." "I want a midwife, and I want a home birth." "Absolutely not, Sammy. This is insane." Many people have home births," she said pragmatically. "Yes, people who used to have home births back in their prairie days. I was just talking about, and they died. Do you hear yourself right now? If there's an emergency, the midwife will be equipped with a kit, and we will not be that far away from the hospital." "We are very far away from the hospital," he said. "It's 45 minutes to Tolowa, and they would have to airlift you. That's expensive. Ask me. I should know." Or ask me how I should know. "I know," she said. "I know that you had airlifted your siblings on your watch, but I'm not going to need to be airlifted. Anyway, thank you for showing your concern through your wallet." "I don't give a hoot about my wallet. I would pay to have you airlifted out of here for fun if I thought it would make you more comfortable. I'm just saying that I want you to be in an I don't want you to be in an emergency. I can't even imagine. Sammy, I could not load you onto a helicopter while you're in labor with my baby and let them take you off to Tolowa and have to follow you behind in a car. It would kill me." "News flash," she said. "This whole thing is not in your control, and it's just something you're going to have to let me make some decisions about. Women have been having children for thousands of years, and dying too for doing it just as long." She made an exasperated sound. "Is that all death with you? Wouldn't it be to you if it were to me? You were to me?" She looked at him, and the lines on his face, lines that he had started earning when he was far too young. "Okay, I get it. You're scared. You're scared about this kind of stuff, and you want me to be the most responsible, but it is my choice, Ryder. I want to do this my way, and I think that my way is good." "I know you do," he said. "Sammy, I know that you're not intentionally going to do something that might hurt you yourself or the baby, but I worry that it might. You're going to worry either way. Sammy, we're married now. We live together. Our lives are part of each other. You can't just be a free spirit and do whatever you want." "A very interesting point," she said dryly. "Since the same goes for you, you don't just get to tell me what to do all the time. It can't be just about you managing your anxiety. I have to be able to live. You're right. Our lives are wrapped around each other, but that does not mean the person with the most anxiety wins." "Sammy, you have to trust me," she said, putting her hand on his arm. "Remember what we talked about a few months ago? I know sometimes that you see me as a haphazard, but I promise you I'm not. I am just as much a control freak as you are. I want to have a baby at home because I want to be able to do it on my terms. I understand that you're worried about it, but not being in a hospital and there not being doctors everywhere. But the last time I went to a hospital, it was because my father," she shook her head, "I don't want to be there to bring my baby into the world. I get that it doesn't take a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense to you, but that is how I feel. You have taken care of me for a very long time. Let me do something for you. Let me—" She stood up and bracketed his face with her hands. Then she moved her thumbs up to his forehead and began to massage the lines there. "I don't want to make you any more stressed. I want to make you less." She kissed his lips. "Yeah, and that's not how this works," he said, "the caring stuff. Why can't you just be? I don't know. You're so worried about everything all the time." "Because everything has been my responsibility for a long damn time. It's easy for you just to say that I worry too much, but if I wasn't around worrying, who would do everything? Who would have made sure that those kids made it to adulthood? Who would have kept the ranch going? Somebody has to worry." Her heart twisted. "Okay, I understand that. Then can you let me be whatever the opposite of that is?" His dark eyes were serious on hers. "Sunshine," he said. "It's sunshine. You have been that for the 17 years. You gave me strength, Sammy. Warmth I didn't have. Without you, I don't think I would have made it. All the irritation drained out of her, and she stretched up on her toes, kissing him gently on the mouth. Thank you. He grabbed her hands and took them from his face, then squeezed them. You're welcome, and it's true. I will be doing the extreme research on this home birth thing. I guess coming from you, that's a compromise. It's probably as good as you're going to get. I don't know. We'll see about that. Marriage is about compromise, Ryder said. And in this case, compromise is probably going to be one of those, going to mean one just, sorry. And in this case, compromise is probably going to mean one of those just not getting what they want. Don't test me. She laughed. Honey, there is this baby naming thing. Is this the hill you want to die on? Surely you wouldn't. Rain, river, forest, sunshine. Crap. Minerva, Service, Luna. No. Frodo. No. You only get so many vetoes in the birthing process, my friend. I'm just saying use them wisely, or your son may grow up to believe that his one true quest is to throw a magic ring into a volcano. He narrowed his eyes. I don't even get that reference. He was a liar, and she loved it. The sad thing for you is that I know how to get the references, because you spent time in my company. You can't do that to a child. Yes, I can. That's the beauty of being the mother. It will teach him to stand firm in his individuality for a very early age. It will teach him how to take a punch to the face. Well, one must learn to do that too. You wouldn't really, wouldn't I? I said I would research it. Wonderful. I'll make an appointment with the midwife. Sammy, he took a very sharp breath. I know I can't do this for you, and that's what kills me, to let you have to take this risk and go through all the pain. And I'll trust you to do your best. Her heart suddenly felt too large and sore along with it. Ryder, I know you're strong, he said. I never thought you didn't. She stretched up and kissed him on the cheek. They would be all right. They just had to be. Well, I think we can do 4 more pages and then we'll call it a night. There was crystals hanging in the window, and Ryder would have given anything to be sitting anywhere else. It was like Sammy's carcass had exploded all over the room, which she supposed was why his wife looked so giddy to be sitting there in the presence of the midwife, who had long gray hair and calming demeanor. You don't want to put crystals on the baby, do you? Ryder asked. No, the woman said, who was in fact named Sequoia. I can put crystals on the mother if she likes, and you can have some too. He sensed a faint hint of sarcasm in that. I'm good. He had a feeling Sequoia was not shocked by his rejection. Everything in here looked airy-fairy, hippy-dippy-dipped in an incense essential oil, and he could feel himself standing out against it all, in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a cowboy hat. Lord, just let Sequoia go home, just saying. Anyway. Like some deeply rooted relic of the past in the middle of, some relics that were deeply rooted in his past, sure, but one that felt pretty danged alternative to him. I might want crystals, Sammy replied. Ryder rubbed the bridge over his nose. Okay, so crystals aside, how exactly does this work? Sequoia went about explaining the process and how some women opted for a water birth, and that she could provide the tub for a rental fee. So you want to put a tub in the bedroom? Wherever you want it, she said. But I think it's best if it's next to the bed in case Sammy wants to move around. Okay, he said, but what about it being sterile and everything? Hospitals are sterile, but there are a lot of illnesses and infections in them as well. Yeah, I get that. It's not like you can clean the air, he sighed, but what if there's an emergency? I have a hemorrhage kit. I have a whole kit for the baby. Used to be an RN, she said, so I've dealt with emergencies in the hospital situations, and I've been a midwife for 20 years. I've almost seen every scenario, and I'm fairly prepared for it. I also won't hesitate to send mom and baby to the hospital if it comes to that, so don't think that I'm going to try and make it all happen at home on principle. First and foremost, the important thing is Sammy and baby to come through it healthy. When and where it happens is secondary. It's wonderful when everything goes to plan, but often babies have an own whim and schedule. You can't get too married to a plan anyway. That was like his nightmare, but then everything about the past few months hadn't gone according to his plan, and if he was honest with himself, in general, it was much happier than he would have ever thought something like this could make him. Because he wasn't just some random woman and some random baby. It was Sammy, and it was their baby. All right, I'll take your point there. Well, no decisions have been made yet, so my schedule does fill up, so give me a call in about 4 weeks and let me know if you would like to have me, and I can help with a prenatal exam. I can also come to the home, have a Doppler to check the heartbeat and all that. Right, he said. After the meeting with the midwife, they drove back into town. It was teeming with people, which was pretty typical in summer, and the influx of tourists who enjoy getting out and seeing a historic town was necessary for businesses that were in Gold Valley. But he always found them slightly annoying. It was his town, and he liked that it was small, liked that he didn't typically have to fight to get a table at the mustard seed, though he did have to get a little bit of fighting today. It was a small building, and it took time to get the patio table to open up for him and Sammy. It was later in the day, so you could eat more fruit, and he was relieved when she ordered a hamburger, fries, and a milkshake. It was a lot more typical of her, and that made him feel a lot better about things in general. Her eyes lit up as soon as the french fry basket hit the table. She drove right into him, chewing happily. And it was like their little world turned on its head suddenly, and that from that angle he could really see, that it didn't matter how his parents had loved each other. It had nothing to do with him. He lived through that loss, and he carried the weight for so many years that everything he had felt teeth and clawed, that he was so aware of the cost of it, carrying it felt like it was dying sometimes. But that didn't mean it wasn't love. No, it might even be deeper because he was so very, very aware of what he felt for it like to lose those people. And Sammy, he didn't know what to call those feelings he had for her, because it was like it was an intrinsic to him that as blood in his veins. It was natural, like the beating of his own heart, like the breath he took. It felt deeper than anything. He equated it to an obsession, need, possession, and living. But he had been far too afraid to call it what it was. I love you, he said. In that moment the words left his mouth. He knew what he meant them in every way. Oh boy. And that had been the very true for a very long time, even truer than this moment, that he loved her as a friend, that he loved her as a wife, and he loved the mother of his child. She smiled vaguely. You know I love you too. And he could hear in that very way she spoke the word that she only meant it in one way, the way that they had said it to each other pretty effortlessly over the past many years. No, he said, picking up one of his own French fries, I'm in love with you. Oh, she said, and some of the joy seemed to go out of her French fry eating. That's not so far away from where we've been, is it? I don't know. You know how I feel about labeling things. Yeah, but we do kind of have labels now, husband and wife. She didn't say anything. Instead, she took a sip of her milkshake, and then she started picking at the top of her hamburger. You don't have to say it, he said. This part kind of reminds you of Beth and Rip again, when they're sitting on top of the roof. And they share that moment where she's like, don't say it. Don't say it until it means something. And their eyes just have that conversation. It's so deep. Sorry, I'm just so emotional. Anyway, and he found that he really didn't, and he found that he really did mean that. He didn't need her to say it, not now. Someday it would be nice. But as he looked at her, the chains that had been holding him in place seemed to fall away, and he experienced a kind of lightness that he didn't think he was capable of feeling. And yeah, along with it came some terror, but it was also more that he would felt afraid of losing her no matter what that he called it. He'd been afraid of losing her. He'd been so consumed by trying to find ways not to call what he felt for her what it was, because he had been in love with Sammy Marshall from the beginning. She wasn't just his sunshine, she was his heart. And it was beating because of her all in it this time. She was the reason, his Sammy, his beautiful Sammy, and yeah, he wanted her to love him the way he did her. But if she didn't, it wasn't a tragedy. He lived through tragedy, and he promised her that nothing would break them. He had promised that he would hold steady, and he promised that he would be loving her, and it would only be a gift. And she nodded, okay. The moment was familiar, too, sitting in the diner eating hamburgers, but this moment wasn't recognizing his feelings, giving names to them. He avoided that for a long time. He didn't know if it was common to have a relationship and break down over a cheeseburger, but it sure as hell was. And he was far too consumed by the implications of his own feelings to fully process that she was essentially saying that she didn't love him, but he couldn't even get up to that place. Not yet. Someday, maybe, but not yet. I've loved you for a long time, he said. His voice was rough. I just want you to know that. Because he wanted to say it, because he wanted to know it, wanted to feel it. He had always felt like Sammy was his freedom, the embodiment of the emotions and exuberance that he could never inhabit. But the truth of the matter was, she made him feel all those things. She was the key to it, and he had locked it away for the time because he had been afraid to call it what it was. Because of the fact that it would mean tying himself down like this, of the fact that it would mean marriage and kids, or it would mean rejection and heartbreak. And he had already experienced loss, and that had been like a bullet to his chest, and he still had the shrapnel in there. He had known that he couldn't take on any more, but if it was Sammy, and he could not. Because he had tied himself down, lost himself to the ranch, to this life, in part so that he would always be entwined with her. He had made himself a mountain, a rock, a man who felt nothing, so that he could handle all that he believed that he could ever be. That was his freedom. And now that he knew what it wasn't half as terrifying as the alternative. Okay, she said. He was tempted to be hurt by that. When he looked into her eyes and saw kind of a hollow fear that he had seen on her face that night, he rescued her from her father, and he ached. We're in this together, he said. Either way, no matter what. She nodded, and they went back to eating. And he couldn't help but marvel at the fact that one of the deepest, most spiritual moments of his life had occurred at the Mustard Seed Diner, and that it had passed as quietly as it come on ferociously. And when it would leave him with an ache in his soul, because his beautiful sunshine girl was somewhere lost in the dark, and he didn't know how to reach her. So he would just love her until he did. I'm so sorry. Anyway, thank you for tuning in tonight. I've got to go get some sleep. I love each and every one of you. I wish you the best. May tomorrow be full of hope, faith, and love. May there be prosperity in your heart and in your bank account. Most of all, remember it's better to give than it is to receive. God bless.